There is a silence in the fossil record that most people never think about. Not the silence of missing bones or vanished animals, but the silence of petals, of pollen, of flowers that opened once, released something into the air, and then closed forever. Plants do not leave behind the same dramatic evidence as the creatures that walked among them. A skeleton holds its shape for millions of years. A flower does not. And yet, scattered across the world in layers of ancient stone, pressed into amber, preserved in pollen grains smaller than a grain of sand, there is a record. A quiet, incomplete, and deeply beautiful record of blooming things that no longer exist. This is the story of one of the most extraordinary and debated discoveries in the field of paleobotany. It concerns a flowering plant, or what scientists believe was a flowering plant, whose reproductive cycle appears to have operated on a timescale almost impossible to imagine. A plant that, based on current evidence, may have flowered so rarely, so infrequently, and so tied to specific and catastrophic environmental triggers that an entire human civilization could have risen and fallen between one bloom and the next. A plant that is gone, completely and permanently gone. And in understanding why it existed, how it lived, and what caused its disappearance, we are forced to confront something profound about the nature of life on this planet. To understand this plant, you must first understand something about the world in which it lived. We are speaking of a period roughly between 160 and 66 million years ago, a stretch of Earth's history known as the Cretaceous period. This was not a world that resembled anything alive today. The continents were still completing their slow drift into something recognizable. The climate was dramatically warmer. There were no polar ice caps. Sea levels were significantly higher than they are now, and vast inland seas divided land masses that we now think of as single continents. The atmosphere held higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, and the temperatures across much of the planet were hot, humid, and consistent in ways that modern ecosystems rarely experience. Into this world, flowers arrived. This is one of the great puzzles of evolutionary biology, and it fascinated Charles Darwin himself, who famously described the rapid appearance of flowering plants in the fossil record as an abominable mystery. Before the Cretaceous, the dominant plant life on Earth consisted of ferns, cycads, conifers, and other non-flowering species. These plants had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. And then, in what is geologically a very short span of time, flowering plants, the angiosperms, appeared and began spreading across the planet with remarkable speed. By the middle of the Cretaceous, they had already diversified into thousands of forms, occupying every available ecological niche, developing relationships with insects, and evolving strategies for dispersal and reproduction that no plant had used before. Most of these early flowering plants bloomed frequently. They were adapted for rapid reproduction, for taking advantage of the warm and productive Cretaceous climate. But there is evidence, fragmentary and still debated among researchers, suggesting that not all early angiosperms followed this pattern. There appear to have been lineages, now entirely extinct, that adopted a fundamentally different strategy. Instead of blooming seasonally or annually, or even over longer multi-year cycles as some modern plants do, these species appear to have developed what scientists describe as extreme mast cycling, an extreme version of a reproductive strategy already observed in some living plants today. Mast seeding is not a new concept. Many modern trees and plants, from bamboo to certain oak species to dipterocarp forests in Southeast Asia, reproduce in massive synchronized events that are separated by years, sometimes decades, of vegetative growth and apparent reproductive silence. The evolutionary logic behind this is well understood. By overwhelming the environment with seeds or pollen all at once, plants can saturate seed predators, ensuring that at least some offspring survive. By spacing these events far apart, they prevent predator populations from growing large enough to consume everything. It is a strategy of calculated scarcity and sudden abundance. But the plant at the center of this story appears to have taken this strategy to an almost unimaginable extreme. Researchers examining fossilized pollen deposits from several Cretaceous-era geological formations, particularly in what is now Central Asia and parts of northern Africa, have noted the presence of a highly distinctive pollen type that appears in the fossil record in dense, concentrated bursts, separated by what the geological evidence suggests are very long intervals. These pollen bursts are not gradual. They appear suddenly, in thick, concentrated layers, then disappear almost entirely, only to reappear thousands of years later in another concentrated layer. The pattern is consistent with a species that flowered en masse, synchronously, and extremely rarely. Scientists are careful about the conclusions they draw from this kind of evidence. Pollen preservation is imperfect. Geological processes can compress or distort time layers. A gap in the pollen record does not always mean a gap in the plant's flowering. It may simply mean that conditions for preservation were poor during certain intervals. These are legitimate cautions, and researchers continue to debate what the pollen record in question truly represents. Some scientists believe the intervals between bloom events could reflect gaps in preservation rather than gaps in flowering. Others argue that the consistency of the pattern across multiple geological sites, separated by significant distances, suggests something real about the plant's biology rather than merely an artifact of fossilization. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that this plant existed. The pollen itself is real, distinctive, and unlike anything found in the modern world. It belongs to a lineage of early angiosperms that has no confirmed living descendants. Its morphology, meaning the physical structure visible under microscopic analysis, suggests a flower that was large relative to the other angiosperms of its time, with a complex internal architecture that would have required specific pollinators to access effectively. This raises a further question that has no certain answer. What pollinated it? If the plant only bloomed once every several thousand years, as the most ambitious interpretations of the evidence suggest, then the insects or animals that depended on it for pollen would have had to survive those intervals on other food sources, returning to this plant's bloom in extraordinary numbers when the flowering finally occurred. There are living analogs, imperfect ones, that help us imagine this dynamic. The talipot palm of South Asia flowers only once in its entire lifetime, which can span between 30 and 80 years and then dies. The century plant, despite its misleading name, flowers once after many years and then also dies. The Queen of the Andes plants flowers once after a century or more. These are extreme by modern standards, but they are still operating on timescales that fall within human experience, within the range of a single human lifetime, or at most, a few generations. The plant described in the fossil record appears to have operated on a timescale an order of magnitude beyond even these extremes. This places it in a category that has no modern equivalent and no obvious parallel in the current plant kingdom. The climate conditions of the Cretaceous may help explain how such a strategy was possible. The remarkable stability of the Cretaceous climate, particularly during certain warmer phases, meant that environmental conditions remained consistent across extremely long periods. A plant adapted to flower only when very specific environmental triggers aligned would have been operating in a world where those triggers, whatever they were, might have aligned on genuinely geological timescales. The precise nature of those triggers is unknown. Researchers have proposed a range of possibilities, including rare alignments of temperature, moisture, and atmospheric composition, volcanic activity that temporarily altered soil chemistry, or disruptions caused by episodic flooding events that provided the plant with ideal germination conditions following a bloom. None of these hypotheses has been confirmed. What makes this plant particularly haunting is not just its rarity, but its eventual disappearance. Like so much of the Cretaceous world, it did not survive the events of 66 million years ago. The mass extinction event associated with the Chicxulub impactor, the asteroid or comet that struck the Yucatan Peninsula and triggered a cascade of environmental catastrophes, including global temperature collapse, dramatic reduction in sunlight, and the destruction of food chains across both land and sea, ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. But it also ended something quieter. It ended thousands of plant lineages that had taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve. The fossil record shows a dramatic collapse in plant diversity at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the layer of rock that marks the exact moment of the extinction event. Many angiosperm lineages simply stop appearing after this boundary. The pollen record of this particular species stops cleanly at this boundary. There is no gradual decline, no slow thinning of pollen deposits over thousands of years, no suggestion that the species was already struggling before the catastrophe. It was present, and then it was not. This abruptness is consistent with the pattern seen across many Cretaceous plant extinctions and suggests that the extinction was not caused by gradual environmental change, but by the sudden and catastrophic disruption of global ecosystems that the impact event produced. A plant that bloomed only once every many thousands of years was particularly vulnerable to this kind of disruption. If the impact event occurred during the long interval between bloom events, the plant would have been in a purely vegetative state, potentially consisting of populations too isolated or too physiologically stressed by the sudden environmental changes to survive until conditions recovered. This is one of the more poignant aspects of the story. The very strategy that had allowed this plant to persist through millions of years of otherwise stable conditions became its fatal vulnerability. A reproductive cycle adapted to the rhythms of a stable ancient world had no mechanism for responding to a catastrophe that operated on the timescale of years rather than millennia. By the time conditions might theoretically have allowed another bloom, the populations had already collapsed. It is worth stepping back for a moment and considering what has been lost. Not just this one species, but the entire ecological web that surrounded it. The insects that evolved in response to its rare blooms, the birds or early mammals that may have fed on its seeds, the soil fungi that likely formed mycorrhizal relationships with its root systems over those long vegetative intervals. The evolutionary pressures it placed on the organisms around it, pressures that would have shaped the development of entire lineages over millions of years. When a species disappears, it does not disappear alone. It takes with it all the relationships it had built, all the evolutionary pathways it had opened, all the organisms that had in some way organized themselves around its presence. The extinction of this plant was not a single loss. It was the unraveling of a network whose full extent we cannot reconstruct. The field of paleobotany has made remarkable progress in recent decades. Techniques for analyzing fossil pollen have become increasingly sophisticated. The use of synchrotron imaging has allowed researchers to examine the internal structure of fossilized plant material in extraordinary detail without destroying the samples. Ancient DNA recovery, while still largely limited to organisms preserved in permafrost or amber from the past several 100,000 years, continues to push its boundaries, and there is ongoing research into the possibility of recovering fragmentary genetic material from much older specimens. None of this will bring this plant back, but it may, over time, allow us to understand it more clearly, to reconstruct something of its appearance, its chemistry, its evolutionary relationships, to place it more precisely within the tree of life and understand what, if anything, living today carries some echo of what it was. There is one final thing worth considering, and it concerns the sheer patience encoded in this plant's biology. Every living thing has a relationship with time. Annual plants live and die within a single year. Some trees live for thousands of years. But this plant, if the evidence is interpreted correctly, has built an entire reproductive strategy around intervals that exceed recorded human history. Every bloom was separated from the last by a span longer than the time between the construction of the Egyptian pyramids and today. This means that across the entire span of human civilization, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present moment, this plant would have bloomed perhaps once, perhaps not at all. It existed in a different dimension of biological time, one that we have no sensory experience of and no instinctive framework for understanding. And yet it was real. It grew, it photosynthesized, it pushed roots into ancient soil, and it raised leaves toward a sun that was slightly younger and slightly dimmer than the one that rises today. It waited. For thousands of years at a time, it waited. And when the conditions finally aligned, it bloomed, releasing its pollen into a world full of creatures that would not survive to see another bloom. It was, in that sense, always blooming into a world that was already beginning to change. The The fossil record does not tell us what it looked like in full flower. It does not tell us what color its petals were, or whether it produced a scent, or how long the bloom itself lasted once it finally arrived. These things are lost, not temporarily hidden or waiting to be discovered, but genuinely, permanently lost to a time that left only the faintest impressions in stone. What remains is a pattern in pollen, a rhythm encoded in geology, a suggestion, quiet but persistent, that life on this planet has taken forms and followed strategies so far outside our ordinary experience that we are still only beginning to grasp the full strangeness of what once existed here. Some things bloom once and are enough.